In October 2015, I made my third trip to the abandoned mining town of Moonville, Ohio. I'd first heard of Moonville during the summer of 1996, long after both it and the railroad that helped build it had been abandoned. Even though the town and railroad are gone now, the area still attracts people wanting to enjoy the beautiful scenery of the area, history seekers, and ghost hunters. The story of Moonville, Ohio has its beginnings in 1856, when the Marietta and Cincinnati Railroad was building west to Cincinnati. At the time, a man named Samuel Coe owned an area of land west of Athens and was looking for a way to ship clay and coal that was being mined on his property. Coe and the railroad struck a deal. The railroad could build across Coe's land for free. In exchange, the railroad would haul the clay and coal from there. Several mines opened in the area, and Moonville grew into a mining town. Moonville was never a large town, only reaching a population of a little over 100 in the 1870s. The town was also quite remote, with residents typically taking a train or walking the tracks to get to the nearby towns of Hope and Mineral. In 1887, the Marietta and Cincinnati was purchased by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Around that time, the town of Moonville began to decline. By 1900, the mines began to close. The last family left the town in 1947, and by the 1960s, the buildings of Moonville were torn down, leaving only the cemetery and railroad, although some foundations from the torn-down buildings are still supposed to exist in the area. After Moonville faded into history, railroad traffic on the route continued. In 1973, the Baltimore and Ohio merged with the Chesapeake and Ohio and the Western Maryland to create Chessie System, and the route became Chessie System's Parkersburg subdivision between Parkersburg, West Virginia, and Chillicothe, Ohio. From October 1976 to September 1981, Amtrak's Shenandoah ran between Washington, D.C. and Cincinnati, Ohio, passing through what was once Moonville. In 1980, Chessie System merged with Seaboard System to create CSX. In June 1985, CSX announced that the Cumberland, Maryland to Cincinnati route over the Parkersburg subdivision was to be downgraded from a main line to a secondary route. By late 1986, CSX stopped using the route, and in June 1988, the tracks over the Parkersburg subdivision were taken out, along with the bridges being removed soon after. For a town as small as Moonville had been, and with its relatively short history, there seemed to be a high number of fatal accidents and incidents in and around the town. In January 1857, a man died after he fell from a railroad bridge in the area of Moonville. In March 1859, a brakeman fell from a train and later died of his injuries. Shortly after that, an 18-year-old man was killed in a mine explosion. In 1873, a brakeman was crushed between train cars in Moonville, and a woman from Mineral was killed on the trestle a mile east of the Moonville Tunnel. In 1874, a drunken man fell asleep on the tracks in Moonville and was killed by a passing train, and 2 freight trains collided in Moonville, killing a fireman on one of the locomotives. In 1876, a brakeman was killed in an accident in the area of Moonville, and a 13-year-old boy died after losing a leg while jumping from a train. In 1880, a man who lived between Moonville and Zaleski to the west was killed while returning home from Athens. Rather than take the train all the way to Zaleski and then walk back to his home, he would jump off the train as it passed by his house. On the day he died, he was thrown 20 feet into a post. That same year, an engineer and fireman were killed when 2 freight trains collided head-on near Moonville. In 1884, another brakeman was killed in an accident. In 1886, a man got into a fight one evening in the Hope Moonville saloon. He was found murdered along the tracks the following morning. In 1890, a 4-year-old boy choked to death on a .22 cartridge. In 1905, a woman was hit by a train on the bridge over Raccoon Creek and later died from her injuries. In that same year, a man was killed when he stepped in front of a train in Moonville. In 1907, a man died after he hopped a freight train and fell off near the Moonville Tunnel. In 1910, a 6-year-old girl died from burns that she received after a hot cup of coffee was spilled down her back. In 1912, a man was killed at the crossing in Moonville when he started across the tracks after a freight train had passed and was run over by freight cars that had broken loose from the rear of the train. In 1920, a miner returning home was killed by a train in the Moonville Tunnel. In 1936, a man was murdered at the inn in Moonville. In 1938, an engineer was killed when his freight train struck a rock slide just west of Moonville. In 1945, a railroad employee working on the bridge over Raccoon Creek was killed when a load of ties shifted and fell on him. In 1986, shortly before the route was abandoned, a 10-year-old girl was killed by a CSX train on the bridge over Raccoon Creek. Railroading in the 1800s was dangerous work, especially for a brakeman. Before the air brake was invented, if an engineer wanted to stop his train, he would apply the locomotive brakes and whistle for the brakeman on the locomotive and caboose to apply the handbrakes on each car. Going over the tops of each car on a clear day was difficult enough. At night, when your only light was a lantern, or in bad weather when snow, ice, or rain made surfaces slippery, the job was especially dangerous. Brakemen were also responsible for coupling and uncoupling cars and locomotives, which was difficult and dangerous since before automatic couplers, a brakeman had to stand between cars as they came together and couple them by hand. If a brakeman didn't move his hand out of the way fast enough, he could easily lose fingers or his hand. Standing between cars as they came together was also dangerous, since a brakeman could easily be crushed or run over. Moonville's remote location seemed to play a part in the number of people who were killed walking the tracks and bridges in the area. For example, in this map of the area, to get from Moonville to the Kings Hollow Tunnel, which are only a little more than 2 miles apart, a road trip between the locations would be a 6.5 to 7.5 mile drive. While that wouldn't be much today in a car, in the late 1800s before the automobile was invented, it would have been a lengthy walk or horse ride. Many people would instead take the risky walk on the tracks to get where they needed. With several bridges and 2 tunnels in the area, there were several locations where people on the tracks wouldn't be able to get out of the way of approaching trains. Even if they heard a train, the curves, hilly terrain, and surrounding forests would muffle the sound and make it difficult to determine how close the approaching train truly was until it was too late. The earliest ghost stories surrounding Moonville began in the early 1890s. According to the February 17, 1895 Chillicothe Gazette, westbound train 99 was just east of the Moonville Tunnel where the 1880 head-on crash had occurred, when the crew spotted a figure in white waving a lantern. Bringing the train to a stop, the crew saw the figure step off the tracks and disappear. According to the article, the phantom had been seen the year before, in 1894. In 1993, the Athens Messenger told of a story about some Ohio University students seeing a light of a lantern in the tunnel. Popular belief is that the mysterious light is one of the railroaders who died in the area between 1859 and 1884. Other stories have circulated regarding a murdered conductor, the bridge over Raccoon Creek collapsing, and a smallpox outbreak in Moonville. However, sources for those stories never mention names or dates pertaining to the events, preventing any verification that the events even occurred. Other spirits seen in the area have been the figure of a man on the hill above the tunnel and the figure of a woman in white along the trail. People have also reportedly heard a train, felt strange, and have been touched in the tunnel. 2 of the stories circulating over the years regarding the railroad route through Moonville were that the line was unsignaled dark territory, and that when the route was upgraded in 1981, a special westbound signal was supposedly installed east of the Moonville Tunnel, with train crews instructed to only stop in the area if the signal was red and not for anybody waving a lantern. According to the July 1, 1980 chassis system timetable, the route actually did have signals and was dispatched by timetable and train orders. In other words, the route was not unsignaled dark territory. According to the August 1, 1981 timetable, the route had been upgraded to centralized traffic control. There were no instructions for a special signal at Moonville. Most people who I have talked to who are familiar with the route agree that there was no signal east of the tunnel, while some have said that there was. If there had been a signal placed east of Moonville, it would have had a normal explanation for railroad operations, like the scene further east at the Kings Hollow Tunnel, where there was a signal placed just before the tunnel. The TV shows My Ghost Story and Haunted Highway have both featured stories on Moonville, but their so-called evidence on the show was questionable. Both shows showed supposed video of the ghost at the end of the tunnel. However, both programs showed what appeared to be the backlit silhouette of a person, mostly washed out by bright sunshine, at the far end of the tunnel, something I saw myself on my first visit to Moonville in 2012. Haunted Highway also showed video of a shadow in the tunnel, which was cast by something off-camera, as well as a supposed light in the cemetery that looked more like a car headlight on the road down below. On the Saturday of May 26, 2012, I made my first visit to Moonville. I arrived about 1:30 in the afternoon and was greeted by a swarm of mosquitoes. I walked down the road and paid a visit to the Moonville Cemetery, surprised at how few headstones there were. Less than a third of the graves have headstones, and some that still existed were nothing more than stubs of stone in the ground. I then headed back to Moonville and went to where the bridge had been over Raccoon Creek. New bridge abutments are in place currently for a new bridge over Raccoon Creek for the hiking trail. However, money is still needed for moving the new bridge into position for the trail. Finding that the river was up, I decided to drive up the road to the other pull-off north of the bridge over Raccoon Creek and took the trail that went along the edge of Raccoon Creek, getting to the tunnel about 2:30 in the afternoon. After checking out the tunnel, I headed east along the old right-of-way, arriving at what used to be the bridge over Hewitt Fork. Looking through the trees, I saw what appeared to be a figure in white at the far edge of the creek. I stepped forward to get a better look and get my camera out, but when I stepped on a twig, the figure spread its wings and flew off. It had only been a large crane, something that may explain some of the sightings of a figure along the trail. I then headed back to the tunnel. Videos shot inside the tunnel yielded nothing unusual. However, I did notice that while in the tunnel, the sound of a vehicle on the road echoes through the tunnel, creating a kind of white noise effect. At times, knowing I was in a railroad tunnel, the sound almost sounded like a rapidly chugging steam locomotive, which may explain some of the train sounds that people have claimed to have heard in the tunnel. At no time while in the tunnel did I see, hear, or sense anything unusual. About 5:30, I headed back to the Jeep and drove back down the road to Moonville for a last look at where the bridge over Raccoon Creek had been, taking in the beautiful scenery of the area. In 2013, I wanted to make a repeat trip to Moonville. However, I wanted to avoid the numbers of people who were hiking through the tunnel so I could try recording videos without interruptions. I made the trip on the morning of Thursday, July 18th, 2013, arriving at Moonville a little before 6:30 in the morning. I went down to Raccoon Creek, but finding that the river was up and the banks were quite muddy, I decided to head up the road to the other pull-off like the year before. I got to the tunnel a little before 7 a.m. With nobody around and no vehicles on the road across Raccoon Creek, the area was quite quiet and peaceful. I set up my camera on the tripod and started recording video as I took my EMF detector and did a walkthrough of the tunnel. Even though I would have heard if anybody else was in the tunnel with me, as I neared the east end of the tunnel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. What I wasn't aware of was what my camera was picking up on the audio portion of the video. It wasn't until I returned home and was listening to the video that I heard what sounded like breathing coming from near the camera while I was at the other end of the tunnel. There were a few other times while in the tunnel that I had the sensation of somebody being near me, even though I was 100% sure that I was alone. As the morning progressed, another strange series of incidents occurred while inside the west end of the tunnel. While in the tunnel, I became aware of a loud commotion outside on the hill. sounding like somebody or something coming down the hill through the brush. I would step out of the tunnel to see what was making the noise, and as soon as I came out of the portal of the tunnel, the noise would instantly stop. I would scan the hillside, unable to find anything causing the noise. Shortly after going back into the tunnel, the noise would start up again, stopping whenever I stepped out of the tunnel. At no time during my visit did I see any wildlife, and at the time, no vehicles had gone by on the road on the other side of Raccoon Creek, meaning that there were no other visitors in the area. Around 10 a.m., I headed back down to Raccoon Creek to take in the scenery, and after a few minutes, I started the hike back to the Jeep, stopping at several spots along the trail to get some pictures of the scenery. As I got back to the Jeep, a couple and their 2 kids showed up and hiked up the trail to the tunnel, the first people I had seen on the trip. I then headed down the road for a quick visit to the Moonville Cemetery, and then drove east to visit the Kings Hollow Tunnel. My third visit to Moonville was on the afternoon and evening of Thursday, October 15th, 2015. That week had good weather here in Ohio, and with the cooler fall weather, there were no problems with mosquitoes. I again chose to go to Moonville during the week to avoid the higher number of hikers that come through on the weekends. Around 4:15 in the afternoon, I arrived at the 2 former grade crossings west of Moonville, stopping to get a look down the right-of-way in both directions at both crossings. arrived at the cemetery about 4:30. While I had visited each of the graves on my previous trips, I did so again, this time leaving pennies on each of the headstones, as many people have done in the past. With no mosquitoes, I was able to stay a little longer than on the previous trips. As I went to leave, I started recording video on my digital camera of the drive back down to Moonville, and had the first unusual incident occur. As I turned my Jeep around the cemetery, I realized that the camera was not recording video. Thinking it actually hadn't started recording when I pressed the button, I started the recording again. When I got to Moonville, I discovered that the camera had stopped recording on its own. There was no low battery light lit, and when I'd restarted the video, the counter started counting down from 25 minutes and 8 seconds, indicating that the memory card wasn't getting full. Somehow, while I'd been turning the Jeep around, the camera had stopped recording by itself. After getting to Moonville, I took a look around and then headed down to where the bridge over Raccoon Creek had been. Finding that the river was down, I headed back to my Jeep, got the rest of my gear, and packed dinner, and headed off for the tunnel. With the river down, I was able to make my way across the rocky footbridge for the first time of any of my visits to Moonville, carefully testing each step as I slowly made my way across. I then paused to take in the views of the river. I got to the tunnel, and after walking through, I headed east along the old right-of-way while it was still daylight. East of the tunnel, I found some chunks of concrete along the north side of the right-of-way. I hadn't noticed them on my first visit in 2012, most likely since I'd visited during the summer when brush was overgrown. The concrete was about where the supposed signal east of the tunnel was supposed to have been. I headed east, checking out the rest of the right-of-way. Nearing Hewitt Fork, I found where some of the old ties were still in the roadbed. Looking over the area, I did not have a repeat of the previous incident in 2012, where I had seen what had appeared to be a figure in white that had turned out to be a large crane along the creek bed. I then headed back to the tunnel. Approaching the concrete chunks, the tunnel was just coming into view. The chunks of concrete were right about where the signal was supposed to have been. While I was sure that there was a normal explanation had there been a signal at that location, I was now wondering what the concrete chunks were from. Before I could examine the concrete further, I noticed that the camera base on my tripod was missing. Somewhere along the trail, the latch had popped open, and the base had popped off. Since it was only an hour before sunset, I hid my gear along the trail and headed on a quick jog back east, thinking I'd never find the part on the trail with all the leaves that had fallen off the trees. Miraculously, shortly before getting to the former bridge over Hewitt Fork, I found the camera base sitting out in the open on a patch of old ballast. I then headed back to the tunnel and ate dinner while wandering around in the tunnel. Shortly after 6:30, a small group of people came through to see the tunnel and then left. A little before 7 p.m., I started recording video of the tunnel while I did a walkthrough with my EMF detector. Not detecting anything, I decided to take the EMF detector out on the trail between the tunnel and Raccoon Creek. At 7 p.m., I was at the east end of what had been the bridge over Raccoon Creek, and that was when things took a strange turn. With no electricity or anything to cause an EMF field, my meter shouldn't have picked up anything on the trail. About to head back to the tunnel, I was facing the river when the detector suddenly got 7 rapid spikes that maxed the scale on the meter. As suddenly as they'd come, the spikes stopped. I aimed the meter around me, but wasn't able to pick them up again. Turning around to head back to the tunnel, the meter again got 7 more rapid spikes that maxed the scale. Again, they stopped as quick as they started. I turned off my cell phone and left it and the flashlight I had on me a distance away to rule out any interference from them, even though my cell phone always gives a steady reading on the EMF detector and only goes halfway up the scale. Over the course of several minutes, I kept getting the same series of 7 spikes on the meter, whether I was moving the EMF detector around or standing still. The spikes then just stopped completely. Unfortunately, I'd left my digital camera on the tripod back at the tunnel recording video, and was not able to catch any of the EMF spikes on video. Returning to the tunnel, the camera was still recording video. Shortly after returning, though, the low battery light came on, even though it had been fully charged when I put the battery in just before doing the walkthrough of the tunnel and the strange EMF readings at the former bridge location. With the sun going down, I turned on my lantern, which had been functioning normally at home the night before. However, it didn't seem as bright as it should have while in the tunnel. I turned on the flashlight that I had taken with me on the trail, and it lit with a yellowish tint like it wasn't at full power. I charged both battery packs for the flashlight before I'd left home that day. By 7:45, the tunnel and the surrounding forest were pitch dark. With the growing darkness, the temperatures were dropping to about 50 and falling. With the growing cold and my lights acting up, I decided to head back to the Jeep while I could, taking even longer to get across the footbridge over Raccoon Creek. I headed home around 8:15 p.m. Upon getting home, my lantern and flashlight both worked normally. However, that weekend I took the battery pack that I hadn't used on the trip and went to use it in my cordless drill. It was drained, even though both had been fully charged before the trip. So after 3 trips to Moonville, do I believe the area is haunted? While none of my evidence would hold up as 100% proof, I do believe, based on my experiences, that there is something there. I've heard some people say that each trip to Moonville has been different for them, and it has been that way for me. Hopefully future trips will yield more evidence of the happenings at Moonville. If you are planning on visiting Moonville, please keep in mind that the Ohio Department of Natural Resources does have a curfew on the Zaleski State Forest from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. When visiting, please do not add to the trash, graffiti, and other vandalism of the tunnel, cemetery, or trail. Also, please be sure to drive with caution on the road leading to Moonville. It's narrow and unpaved, with no guardrails in several areas where there are steep drop-offs next to the road. Also, be sure to watch out for wildlife in the area. On my last 2 trips, I have seen deer and even a large turtle on or near the roads in the area. Also, if you visit in the warmer months, make sure to take plenty of insect repellent with you. The cemetery, tunnel, trail, and other artifacts of the past at Moonville are a kind of memorial to the people who lived and died in Moonville. The story of Moonville is not only part of Ohio's and railroading's past, but also a part of America's past when this country was growing and moving west. The town of Moonville may have faded into history, but remnants of its past are still around. And quite possibly, some of Moonville's residents, for whatever reason, may be staying around as well.